Solia, welcome back.
Yeah, hi.
I think there's been a lot of feedback about the first video, and everybody was after my life. When is part two coming out? When is part two coming out? So, this is part two. We are going to be discussing post 1947, right? We term it as the year of communalism, where the communalism started.
So 1947, we can say, is the start of the modern Jammu and Kashmir in its new territorial, demarcations and boundaries and other things. Because in the past, there was Kashmir Valley, there were other kingdoms, there were a lot of other things. So the founder of the modern state of Jammu and Kashmir is Maharaja Gulab Singh. And he's the one who annexed other territories into it, including the northern areas, Ladakh, and created the what we call as the undivided state of Jammu and Kashmir.
Consolidated the territory. Consolidated the territory.
So he's the one who got all those Gilgit-Baltistan and all those things in the modern state. Now, the thing is that usually, while talking about history, if you talk about with any Kashmiri Muslim or something, he will say that the Dogra regime was very oppressive and all. And those things are reinforced by biased storytellers like Mridu Rai, who is basically just a political activist masquerading as a historian, trying to cheerlead all these Azadistas, Intifada Factory and all that kind of thing. So now let's take that claim that they were oppressive. So usually when they talk about oppression, they talk about Begar, the forced labor. I will talk about how it was prevalent in all the kingdoms and other rulers, including the Sultanate, the Mughals, the Durrani rule, Afghan rule, the Sikh rule. And it was actually the Dogras who first time tried to reform it, if not abolish it. So when Gulab Singh took over the reins of the new territory and started administering Kashmir as a part of the whole state, it was much larger than the Kashmir Valley. So what he did was he tried to reform them immediately. So what he did was that he said that he found that the Muslim governor of the Sikhs, there was the Sheikh Imamuddin, Muslim governor. He was very exploitative, oppressive. He gave away land rent-free to his friends and other things. And he sort of neglected the shawl industry. He did not, work for the interests of the Serbs and other things. He had completely oppressed the people. But he was, though it was a Sikh rule, but he was a Muslim governor. So in comes Maharaja Gulab Singh, and he says that, you have to pay compensation for whoever is taken to do this labor. He has to be given a compensation. So he said that, they have to be given 1 mansar of rice every month, in addition to food, while the person is employed. And if the person is not employed for that labor, taken for labor, they still get a returnership kind of a thing, half of what they would get if they go out and work. So we have to understand that in the past, the connectivity was road connectivity and other things through rough terrain was very difficult. So even the British and other people before him, the Sikhs, the Afghans, the Mughals and the Sultans, and even probably the Hindus before that, they used to take laborers, used to carry people, luggage, good, and for, logistics of the supply chains and other things, they used to carry all those food, ammunition and other supplies to different areas. So this is the guy who introduced that reform. He did not abolish it. But he introduced those reforms for compensation and even gave a retainership kind of a fee for those who were not employed. He reformed and reorganized the shawl sector. And the Shagids were no longer considered serfs and other things. He gave incentives for launching new businesses, saying that for the first few years you don't have to pay taxes, or you have to pay half the tax and other things to boost the local entrepreneurship and other things. He actually did a lot more than was done by the predecessors or by the contemporaries of other kingdoms. So they were very progressive. So we'll come to why these people are singled out as being the oppressors and not the others.
Fine. I just want to ask, is all of this documented?
Yeah, you can follow the threads of Voice of Dogras. You can follow Manu Khajuria's those tweets and other things. I learned a lot from that because that history is also not taught to us. So I think some Panikar or somebody has written a book on Maharaja Gulab Singh where all these reforms and other things are written.
I will be calling Manu Khajuria on the platform.
Yes, because this episode I will be talking about more about the neglect of the Hindus of Jammu and to appease the Muslim communalists in the valley, and I will talk about the process.
Go on.
And that is one of the things is that Begar and all that oppressive that kind of. Then other thing is that so that does not stand up to scrutiny when we compare with other people of that milieu or in the past. So they will not talk about Sheikh Mohammeddin. They will talk about these people. They will talk about how he bought us or something like that. Then the other thing is that they occupied all the Jagirs and other things, and we were reduced to serfs and all. That is also a presentism, a post hoc kind of a projection into the past. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny. If we look at the holdings, the land holding pattern before 1950, when the land reforms were enacted, in 1950, if we see that, we see that in Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh at that time, there were around 5 lakh canals that were occupied as big Jagirs, and they were distributed among some 27 families, which included the Wazirs and Diwan and other court people, high-ranking people. And out of those 5 lakh, 1.5 lakh canal was given away as Jagirs in Kashmir Valley. And out of those these things, there were several Muslim elites, two ziyarats who were given Jagirs, big Jagirs, and there were a couple of Pandits, and the rest were Dogra aristocracy and other people. So even if we look at that kind of a thing, that binary Hindu, ruler, Muslim, this thing, it doesn't hold up to scrutiny also. I will talk about one particular family, Kashmiri elite family, based in the valley, who were the longest continuous beneficiaries of the Dogra rule.
Really?
And how their descendants are now the ones who are spreading hate against Hindus and other things. So it will tell us about how communalism works, despite the claims, the biggest beneficiaries are the ones who are leading the misinformation campaign against their former benefactors. So I'm going to talk about the family of the famous Kashmiri American poet Aga Shahid Ali.
Seriously?
His family. Yeah.
Okay, go on. I would love to hear this.
Yeah, because this tells you that not just is it false, but it is like the same people are the ones who are perpetuating these myths about the.
I am surprised.
Yeah.
Go on.
So around the rule of Maharana Rambir Singh, the great grandfather of Aga Shahid Ali, named some let me just quickly brush up the name because I don't remember the names fully, and then I end up
Please go
saying the
ahead.
wrong.
I'm also going to look because this is terribly, terribly revealing for me. The country
Yeah,
without a
Aga Muhammad Bakir. Aga Muhammad Bakir. He was appointed as the chief physician, the royal, the royal physician, the court physician
Okay.
in the Dogra rule.
Mhm.
And pleased with his work, the Maharaja Rambir Singh, he rewarded him. He gave him a lot of titles and made him Darbar Nishini and all those ranks and other these things. They gave him 1,000 canals of land in Anantnag, in Khag, Badgam, in Srinagar. 1,000 acres for that guy. And then he went on to get the Unani medicine translated from Latin and Arabic into Dogri and Persian. And he also the Dogras through him also established some 27 medical centers and Department of Medicine and things like that. So they were amply rewarded for their services, and rightly so. So it just shows that the Dogras were not interested in just the religious aspect of this thing. They looked at the merit of somebody. So well-deserved kind of titles, and we should not criticize the things that happened in the princely kingdoms and all, because that was the Nizam. When we juxtapose our current norms of secularism about our democratic rights and voting and other things, and try to judge the past because of that, we are indulging in a historical fallacy called presentism. Anyway, to continue, so after he was gone, his only son, Aga Ali Baki Kizilbas, or his son, Aga Bakir's son, he was appointed as the chief physician. And the titles and benefits and other things continued. And since the aristocracy had some jobs reserved for them, so he got all his relatives into the. You look at the first judge, look at the Thanedar, you look at Tehsildars, you look at all. These are all from that family. I'm not even talking about other families.
Okay.
There were other.
One single family, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that is how they have lived their life completely at the, it was at the behest of all the Dogra and all these, that they enjoyed all that clout in their society and all. Now let us look at Aga Shahid Ali, their descendant.
We are not going to talk about the father, not the father, Aga Ashraf Ali.
I mean, he was one of the same people. Otherwise, I had talked with him. I wasn't impressed by either his knowledge or.
I was impressed because he seemed to be openly atheist then. Arshad took me to meet him. Like in the last few years of his life, I saw him make a complete U-turn. Suddenly, all these religious injunctions were coming, all these happened.
They bide their time.
Anna?
They bide their time.
So for me, it was so amazing to see that. I thought you were going to talk about the father, but let's go ahead to the son. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
He's the national.
So
national poet, right? The country without the post office, right?
Yeah, so you should realize that it is. Let's forget about his literary this thing. I have much to say about that also, but that's for some other time when we discuss literature.
I teach him in class 11th. I can't forget. Amitabh Ghosh is obituary for him. This is something we teach, and Indian students are getting aware of it. So
let's get on track.
Go on. Go on.
So in the preface to the country without a post office, in the preface, he invokes that tearjerker kind of image of Haba Khatun and how she was pining for the return of Yusuf Chak. And he ends that paragraph by saying that we have not been free since then. So he is talking about Yusuf Shah Chak as the last independent Maharaja of Raja of Kashmir. Now let me tell how he is completely wrong. First of all, he was not a Kashmiri. His family were recent converts who had come from Dardistan, Gilgit, Hunza Valley. From that, he was from that. So before, right now, it may seem like a part of Kashmir, but that is only because Gulab Singh made it part of the state. Before that, it was a completely different terrain and territory and kingdom altogether. So first of all, he was not an ethnic Kashmiri. Those were recent converts of that and other. And second, he was not the last. If we even use Aga Shahid's limited logic to say that, okay, whatever it is, he was the last. No, it was his son. And what they will not tell you is that the people of Kashmir begged Akbar to come and take these, defeat these usurpers away. And Makhdoom Sahib Raina and Baba Daud Khaki and all those, they sent entreaties to Akbar, the Mughal emperor, and telling him to get rid of this Chak dynasty. Chak, they are pronounced in Kashmiri as Sak. Anyway, yeah. Anyway, so his son, Yaqub Khan, Yaqub Shah Chak, he outdid his father in oppressing the Sunnis of the valley. This guy declared, Emperor Akbar as an infidel and a heretic. He imposed jizya on the minorities. And you know how they like to tell it? That he recognized minorities. When he started extracting text from them, they try to, these false historians, including Aga Shahid Ali and all, they say that he recognized them, okay, you owe me money. That is the kind of recognition. So he was, his reign also last this thing. But the thing is, the question is that why did Aga Shahid Ali leapfrog 400 centuries to that place? To that era in history, and completely said that, the Mughal rule is foreign, the Sikh rule is foreign, the Afghan rule is foreign, even the Dogra rule is foreign. Now, it is only because of the Dogras that part from which the dynasty of Chak family came, it is only because of Dogras that is part of this, the whole. And that's so, the thing is that it is pretty clearly a communal and very parochial kind of a way. And that is also not accurate, because that's, Hunza, Gilgizistan, they are more like Ladakh rather than this thing. So if he was kosher, him coming and taking over the valley of Kashmir was kosher, what is problem if Jammu, only 200 kilometers south, if they take over the reins of this thing, how they are outsiders and not the other guy? That is where the communalism plays a role. Even in so much, one might talk fluently, eloquently in English and all that. But we know, see, another thing is that the Dogras, they try to enact certain reforms, like there was a tenancy, Kashmir Tenancy Act 1923 and other thing. So they tried to help the downtrodden people a lot, contrary to this thing. But you remember Basharat Peer, because he hobnobbed with all these Aga Shahid gang and his cousins and other guys in New York. So he is the one who said that I will not attend Harud Literary Festival because one of the organizers is the granddaughter of the Maharaja, and I will never forget how they horrible boo, blah, blah, blah. That, the writer is not a jukebox.
I know.
Bracket mein for India or for Kashmir, but for Pakistan, yeah, he's a jukebox. So this is where that, inheritance of guilt and, the sins of the fathers and all, that kind of racist, xenophobic, that kind of a thing is part of the intellectual, this thing. And talking about beggar, as I said, that it was before also. It was during the Chak rule also. And there was a lot of oppression. Why he sings praises of him and says that, oh, they all become Hava Khotuns and start weeping up about Yusuf Sachak. The thing is that if somebody tried to reform what they call as slavery, but couldn't abolish it, isn't that exactly the same case with Muhammad? How come he is the best role model in the world and these people are the worst? That is where you see that there is no logic, there is no uniform standard. It is purely communalism us versus them. But the marginalization of the Hindus, it actually actively, of Jammu particularly, it actively started in 1930. Of course, the Great Game and all was keeping British interested in the era, and they were trying to play one card against the other and all. But it is when Maharaja Hari Singh attended the Round Table Conference in London in 1930, and the British had set the stage conference in such a way they thought that these princely states, they are going to side with us because they are more close to us than other this thing. So they thought that this was like the British attempt to counter demands from Swaraj, self-rule from different parts of India. So they thought that, okay, this Maharaja Hari Singh, since he is the most progressive and most British educated, they took proper care of giving him the proper education and all the British. So they thought that this guy is going to be your asset there. But this guy was an idealist. So he said that while we enjoy friendship with the British, but we cannot overlook the fact that the entire people of India want them out. And we want to, I would also want, despite my personal opinions and benefits that I received from the British, I want India to enter into the Committee of Nations. So he was the chairman of the princely states for that meeting.
I've seen the photo.
And when the British were completely livid that they did not expect him to talk about the independence of India because he was a nationalist. So what they did was immediately the plan started to destabilize him and talk about that you are talking about taking us out. You are talking about Jallianwala Bagh and other things. Let us have those in your backyard. And that was 1930 and 1931. You have those that cook Abdul Qadir. He was a servant of one of the British military officers posted in Peshawar, and he started that revolt. And all the British agents, including Sheikh Abdullah and other people, they chipped in and they tried to reenact the Jallianwala Bagh massacre.
Those are the
and there were communal rights, and Hindus were targeted. A lot of other places there were false rumors, this thing about desecration and the typical this kind of a thing. So Maharaja was completely their enemy. Like after 1930, he was completely, and they tried everything to discredit him. And to discredit him, what they did was that they propped up Sheikh Abdullah, who at that time was one amongst many other leaders who were vying for attention. He was not the tallest except for his height. There were many other contenders at that time. So the British used Nehru and Sheikh Abdullah to target the Maharaja, to teach him a lesson. And they encourage the Muslim communalism, sub-nationalism, and those kind of things, and exile the poor Maharaja to Mumbai. Although like if we compare him head to head, person to person among the peers, he was one of the most educated and progressive of all. So there you have it. It is what happened after 1947 is a continuation of the same trend, where
What you
Hindus
summarize,
of,
what you
you know,
what you summarized here, post 1947 decades, it doesn't seem more like an effacement. It seems more like a creation of a narrative by
yeah,
demonizing the
yeah.
others,
Previously,
right?
previously the revisionist history was more of competitive or appropriation, cultural appropriation, and things like that, diluting and all, getting all the pundits to, for the sake of peace, getting them to pay obeisance in front of the Muslim shrines, but no vice versa gesture by the Muslim community. So it was a Kashmiriat was a one-way street where Pandits had to bow down to show that they are nice people. So they are so nice that please don't kick us out. But so previously, for example, the multiple exoduses that happened
Yes, 7.
in Kashmir, of Pandits, after the Muslims, the invaders started coming, and this thing, Sultan Butt Khan and other things. So one would say that, okay, you know, so Sultan Sikandar Shakan, he was like, he massacred, all the Pandits, forced them to convert the ones who wouldn't flee. And one would, he destroyed the temples and other things. One would say that, okay, that is sort of like, he was that kind. But then there was also Zainul Abidin. Now let me tell you about something, though it is again a pre-1947 this thing, but the narrative is new. So Zainul Abidin is usually cited by Muslims as somebody who was nice to Pandits. Let me tell you that that wasn't really fully the case. For example, that during Sultan Sikandar's time, all the Pandits had fled the valley, and there was this saying that only 11 families remained, and rest, all the entire population of Pandits had fled out of the valley. So what happened was that during Zainul Abidin's time, there was an epidemic. He wasn't that nice. He was like a selfish person who did not have any expertise, who could local expertise or from his, he could not handle this thing. Then he heard that there is this Shriya Bhatt, Pandit, very knowledgeable person and all. And so what he did was that he summoned him and said that, I will give you this thing, that it has reached my home also, epidemic. Some of my family members are also this. Please somehow do this. I have heard that you know more about it than anybody else. So he cracked down on the epidemic, and I don't know exactly what the disease was, so that's another part for research. But anyway, he was able to stop the epidemic in record time. And happy with his service, Zainul Abidin tried to give him a monetary reward, but he refused that. He said, I only want one thing. He said, all the people, you see that, you see our value now, but all the people, your father and other people, they, chase them out of the valley. I want them to return, and I want the lands that have been taken over by the Turks of the Pandits that came with you, the handful. They were never that big. They were only a handful of elite with the family, royal family and their cousins. So he said that I want them back, and I want you to return that property. So Zainul Abidin was so grateful that he said, okay, you can give it a try. So he was made the minister to get the land back and get the Pandits back. He got a lot of Pandits back to the valley, but he was met with a lot of resistance from local Muslim leaders and Turks and other things. So eventually, Shriya Bhatt, the savior, whose name is cited to make Zainul Abidin seem like a secular person, he was murdered or exiled according to another reading. Yeah. So I am saying that, okay, let's say that Zainul Abidin was a better guy than Butt Khan. But if this happened to somebody, a very person who had been empowered by the, Sultan himself, and if he could be murdered or exiled, so we can easily imagine what the life of Pandits would have been among other who were not as great as Anwar. And rest assured, the Pandits, after Sharia Bhatt's murder, they fled again. Now, what is not told is that for every Buzkan they talk about as Zainul Abidin and all, but even there, if we focus, we see that it was not such a rosy picture. It was not hunky-dory as they try to present it as. And what they do is that they revise things and try to say that, oh, you are fixating on one, look at that, see here, not there. They want you to be selective in your reading. They don't want to face the bare facts, the truth that comes in front of, when we study history. The fact is that in the part one, I talked about that genome-wide research in Kashmir. It was, what I forget to mention, that it was of only Kashmiri Muslims. Yeah, that they don't have any Israeli and Greek these genes in them.
But then
converts, right? But the same research, compared it with a previous research of genome study that was done of the Pandit community. And you know what? The Pandit genome was right at the center of the cluster of the Kashmiri genome, right at the center. So that means genetically, Pandits and Muslims were the same stock, no difference. Look at the other thing that comes out of it. That means that if those guys are Brahmins and these guys say that, oh, we were, low caste, we were oppressed by the Brahmins, that's why. Then how come the genetic makeup is the same if there was no endogamy or something like that? The fact is, which people don't know, is that from since ancient times, Kashmir was a place of only the noble classes. And all the Kashmiri Muslim converts were Brahmins. They were not low caste and other things. In fact, most of the people who do menial work and all, they were usually come from other communities from rest of India to do menial things like sweeping and other things. Just like the Valmikis were got into Jammu and all. So these guys were always the royalty. And it is not because of oppression that they found Islam or Sheikh Naruddin to be an improvement over that of Lal Ded. Kuch nahi hua. These people came, individuals came and said, ek thappad marunga agar convert nahi hua. Unhone bola, ho gaye convert. So they were Brahmins also. So, but the post 1947, this thing, the Mridu Rai type of this thing, they talk about, try to show the divide, caste distinctions and other things.
Yeah.
It's largely not true for the larger Kashmiri this thing. We have Kol, Raina and other, castes in
both
Kshatriya castes and Brahmin castes and Muslim also. They still use that. So the thing is that they try to juxtaposition a leftist class struggle, blah, 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 to explain the forcible conversion that happened in Kashmir. Because they want to give some other mechanism that why these guys were restrictive. No, they were not receptive. They were just scared of the threat, life to their threat. Either they had to flee or convert, So they chose the later, fine, I'm not holding it. But to say today that they did it because they hated the other guys and said that, okay, just like, Ambedkar and all, they say that, okay, we are coming out from the oppressive. Nothing like that in Kashmir. In ancient times, you read Al-Biruni's India, you read anything, they talk about that Kashmiri people don't allow any non-Brahmins and other people to enter there. So what caste they are talking about? Wanted to go there, he couldn't. So all these talk about is that previously there was a competition, a synchronization, social engineering, massacres and other things. But what happened was that Hindu as an enemy was first time created by the British. It was part of the two-nation theory again, extension of that. And that kind of a hatred that got generated out of it, it resulted in 1990. We'll come to that in a while. But we talk about, people talk about the ownership of this thing, that the Kashmir is a small part of the entire region. But even while they marginalize the Pandits, but still, if we look at the larger picture, still they were slightly better off. At least some people were listening to them. But there have been, we talk about, Muslims talk about, say, Gaukatul massacre. Pandits talk about Kashmiri Pandits talk about the Nadi massacre. The Kashmiri Sikhs talk about Chatti Singhpura and all. Nobody is talking about the massacre of Hindus in Jammu region, in Doda, in Udhampur.
Mirpur massacre. Mirpur.
Yeah, overnight they massacred entire villages there. And these people are saying that what about our blood? Our blood will not go waste. Then their guys went waste, because nobody talks about them. It is only, and if you look at 1947 onwards, Nehru and all, even Indira Gandhi in 1975, they always tried to appease the Kashmiri Muslim communalists. And at the cost of the Pandits and at the cost of the Dogras, this kind of a thing. So if we talk about post 47, it is a new kind of a thing, where previously outsiders came, they knew they were outsiders, so they were trying to sort of, until maybe Butchkan or something, they tried to maintain some bonhomie. But after 1947, it has been a completely bipartisan kind of thing.
You wanted to talk about the distribution of land in the 1950s, the Jagis. You wanted to talk about that.
Yeah. So I talked about a little bit that before that the big Jagirs were held by Muslim ziyarats and some individuals belonging to aristocracy, and in which there were Muslims and Pandits and mostly Dogras and this thing. That was the way it was. So the unique feature of land reforms that happened in J&K is that the government did not take the burden of giving compensation to the people whom it snatched away this thing. So while there were other land reforms are there, but the government had to pay them. It is only here that the government left them high and dry. And it was not passed on to the tenants or the serfs or something. There was a second level of in the wings of wannabe aristocrats and high class people in society and all. It was given out to those people, their people. It was a time to say that, okay, whoever is following me and all, and dole out all these benefits to them. So it didn't really benefit them. It benefited some families again, most of them. So that is another thing. It's like, then, we talk about erasing of Hindu history, then what could be more, like you said last time, what could be more than denying that they had multiple exoduses in the past, and in 1990 there was the 7th exodus that happened. So they not just deny the entire past, then saying that, oh, Zainul Abidin got them back and blah, blah. They went away during Zainul Abidin's time. So what we have here is denial. It is not changing history, but it also denies, because you are denying one version of this and telling them,
effacement also covers them.
So they will cook up all the Jagmohan and all hearsay, and they will in the same sentence say that a lot of Muslims also played. So what they are trying to do is that they are trying to deny that there was a role of terrorism, and they still are denying that. And in Khamosh Kashmiri and other places, I have discussed why they always have to agree with the Pakistan ISPR and the terrorist version, or the Turkic version, or the other version. They invoke all during the partition riots that happened. They talk about only the what they call a Jammu massacre. No, it was a Jammu Punjab partition riots. It was riots. Riots means two sides were involved. They were fighting, and in one place they were more dominant, and these were weak, and in the other place the other people were more dominant, and these were weak. But there were two fighting sides one side. By calling it a massacre and all, it was as if they were rounded up and killed and all. And Ian Stephens of Statesman, it was like Awami League Press, and they tried to show that the displaced people are, the missing people are all dead, which is not the case. And what these guys will not talk about is that during those riots, some 38,000 Hindus and Sikhs were massacred, and that was a massacre because it was the city rising against the people, not some and some spies and other Muslim spies and all. They will not talk about the 38,000 Sikhs and Muslims massacred in Mirpur and Muzaffarabad. But they will talk about this, add another lakh dead every year. A trend started by Alisha Gilani and Arundhati Rai. Every year they increase a lakh or something like that.
Yes.
If we consider that around, if we look at the partition rights figures and we say that, like there was some 10% people dead for every 90 people who fled. Like that is like a thumb rule to see what would be the ratio between displaced and this thing. So it's like, but just to be consistent on this, by the same token, if we are talking about 200,000 missing, I would say, okay, 20,000 Muslims died. But they said that no, 2 lakh people died, even though that wasn't the population of people in that time. So they spruce up all these from Kashmir News Service and all these ISPR PR propaganda sites, and they don't talk about that it was a consequence when the raiders and other people, they and there was massacre of the Hindus and Sikhs from across started landing here. There was a lot of anger and all, and it is to be seen as a partition rights, not as a massacre. But all the cherry picking, they will not talk about Sheikh. It is that now it is more selective. Previously it was mixture, add this, add that, present it in give it a new presentation spin, and add, present it that way. But now it is completely deny the other side and cherry pick the ones that help you. And the ones where you don't look good, then don't talk about it. Stop everybody from talking about it. So it's a new era of lies.
I'm going to sum it up. Part 1 and part 2. What comes up is that there has been an effacement of Hindu history before 1947. 1947 to 1990, more of a creation of a narrative. And post 1990, it's mostly been denial and embellishments, what you say.
Yeah.
So there's been three phases.
Basically, ISPR 101, whatever their brief is, the newspapers, value-based newspapers would publish that. The intellectuals would say that. So they would sort of like a self-serving echo chamber kind of a thing, group thing, where they don't allow any other point of view.
Agreed.
That's why these newspapers at Jammu edition and Srinagar edition, there was a different set of stories going on in Srinagar and different set in.
How to counter this now? This is next generations coming up, right? We have a lot of work to do, but how to counter this?
See, as much as I am interested in history, finally, I say that people matter more than stories or this thing. Stories we can spin again, we can do that. But the narratives can be countered with facts and genetic studies and other things. But what about the people that have, been expelled or who died as a result of all this ignorant, arrogant, aggression and terrorism and all? I mean, I think we should end this that stories are all very fun. We laugh. Last time we had a good laugh and all. But it is much more serious. Is that we just counter stories that is not enough until we rehabilitate the people and the secularists who had to escape because their point of view cannot be said. The Muslim secularists, the Muslim atheists, those kind of things. If they cannot be rehabilitated, it's more about the present, the people who want to be there but can't because there are certain factors there we are pushing back.
I think
that is the more important thing than any story.
Giving space. I call us ideological refugees in our own country, right? And I agree. I agree. We need a space back in our
ideological, minority is fine. But to be a displaced person in your own country, that tells you how the state is complicit.
Yes, absolutely.
In this, because state is like I said last time, is the most powerful entity in a country. And if it happens under the watch and 30 years have happened and they are not rehabilitating or having a blueprint for how to bring Pandits back, I think then we are just going to keep on talking about stories and other things for the rest of our life and nothing will happen. I think the urgent need is the human need. Other things will keep on happening. People will come after that. I think 30 years since there will be people, our descendants will be more detached from this thing and they will be probably more objective than us because we are also products from the same. They will tell us that, you guys were talking about only Muslim atrocities. Maybe there was other thing. Fair enough. But we are also products of the same. And we feel the Pandits because we have also been made marginalized and victimized, the liberal and progressive Muslims of Kashmir.
Yeah. So we understand
that's why we identify with.
We understand the plight. Yes,
I think that is this thing. And good thing is that Jammu is on the rise.
Yes.
Now it will get back its recognition. Its script, Dogri script.
I'm glad that Jammu is fighting back. Especially they have this big fiasco on Twitter about tourism. The Kashmir tourism logo.
Yeah,
and
every symbology.
It's humiliating. Yeah, it's very humiliating.
And it is all done by Indian media, Bollywood and all. Like people tell me, you are a Kashmiri. Do you live in a houseboat?
Yeah. And even Indian media channels can't differentiate between Jammu and Kashmir. I understand Washington Post not understanding. I understand New York Times not understanding. लेकिन तुम लोगों को क्या हुआ? तुम तो इसको अपना मानते हो.
Betrayal of the intellectuals.
तुम्हें जम्मू and Kashmir
It's called the betrayal of the intellectual. Julian Bella. It's about how intellectuals then try to justify all these fascist tendencies and narrow parochial, theo-fascist movements and other. I think it's a betrayal of intellectuals. We are only doing it for self-survival. Actually, we might also have betrayed them. But since we are unable to change and convert for their, comfort.
We were offered, it's not that we were not offered, but then, certain ethics and principles come in place. We were offered. It's not like the Intifada factory did not offer us. I'm sure you got an offer as well. I got many offers. But no.
Oh, yeah.
But
they tried to. Mridu was trying to
sleep comfortably at night. I have a healthy child. That's all. Because karma always comes back. Always comes back.
Yeah. And after this Article 370 was scrapped in August 2019. Guess whose blood paid? It was the unspoken Hindus who were massacred in Jammu and all. They are the ones who won. And all these people, they are still losers who were talking about us, me. Absolutely. They are the ones who are losers.
Yes.
Because they think that their blood is redder than those and
they even they even twist his khoon chuba Rav Diwan. They twist that and say hamara khoon, it's going to speak up. Arey, unka khoon nahi hai. True, absolutely. Thank you so much, Saulya. It's been another enlightening session. Looking forward to doing this once more. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Kashmiri poet, graphic artist, writer, cultural critic, Saleh. I know I'm going to get a lot of feedback on this. Absolutely a lot of feedback. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome.